Welcome to an anatomical pathology overview on cell injury, as well as the differences between apoptosis and necrosis. This is a very popular test question topic, no matter where or for what exam you're studying. But other than that, it's actually very important to know and understand the differences. But first, we'll have to understand the difference between reversible and irreversible cell injury, and then that irreversible cell injury leads to cell death, either apoptosis or necrosis. So let's dive right in. Cells exposed to a noxious or damaging stimulus, as in a harsh chemical or a mechanical force, will attempt to adapt by repairing and or changing. In the event that it cannot adapt appropriately, the cell will be injured. This injury is either reversible or irreversible. Reversible cell injury means the damage can be repaired and the cell can be restored to its normal homeostatic conditions. On the other hand, irreversible cell injury means the cell's proteins and or DNA are damaged beyond repair. Therefore, this cell must undergo either apoptosis or necrosis. Think of a car. If the car has a small dent in its body, it can be repaired. But if the car is completely flattened by a truck, that damage is irreversible, and the car will most likely have to be scrapped. Now that we've discussed what happens when a cell is injured, but what exactly are these damaging stimuli? In other words, what are the causes of cell injury? They include nutritional deficiency, as in the cell is starving and not being supplied with the fuel needed to survive, for example, no glucose for respiration, and thus no ATP or energy production. Then we look at physical injury due to mechanical force, such as friction or pressure on the cell. And then next, infections, a very important cause of cell injury. For example, Epstein-Barr virus, also known as human herpes virus 4, which may cause Burkitt's lymphoma, a type of cancer of the lymphatic system, more specifically a type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And then also another example, human papillomavirus, which may cause cervical cancer. Next, we look at chemical injury due to exposure to damaging irritant chemicals, and then ischemia, in which the tissues become hypoperfused, meaning they are not getting enough blood. This causes the oxygen saturation of the tissue to drop, which in turn impedes the ability of the tissue to respire. Ischemia has many different causes, often due to a thrombus, also known as a blood clot, or an atherosclerotic plaque, obstructing the lumen of a blood vessel, amongst others. Then we look at aging causing cell injury due to continuous wear and tear and oxidative damage of cells. And then finally, immunological reactions such as hypersensitivity reactions, for example, accumulation of immune complexes in hypersensitivity type 3 reactions. These cause reversible or irreversible damage. Reversible if the stimulus stops and the tissue is allowed to repair. Irreversible if the stimulus persists and is of a high intensity. Injuries that are often purely reversible are due to accumulations of substances in cells, as in accumulation of lipids or proteins or glycogen or water or pigments, and the list goes on. All of these are supposed to be in the cell, but only at normal concentrations. Remember the saying, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. This ties in with the principle of homeostasis, maintaining a constant internal environment or milieu. Now let's compare necrosis and apoptosis, which are forms of cell death after irreversible damage. Necrosis entails swelling of the cell, whereas apoptosis sees the cells shrink. In necrosis, swelling of the mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum causes myelin figures to form. This does not occur in apoptosis. Myelin figures are rolled up lipid bilayers. These lipid bilayers are found in the walls of mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum. These organelles swell and fragment, causing the phospholipid accumulations called myelin figures. Just to emphasize, myelin figures are not observed in apoptosis, only in necrosis. Next, necrosis is accompanied by inflammation, whereas apoptosis is not accompanied by any inflammation, a very important point to keep in mind. Necrosis is always pathological compared to apoptosis, which is mostly physiological when within normal limits, or pathological when inadequate or excessive. Apoptosis is therefore physiological when it occurs at rates which are within normal limits, but it can be pathological when it starts spiraling out of control at rates far exceeding the norm, or when apoptosis is not occurring as it should, such as in cancers, where cells continue proliferating, but then they just don't undergo any apoptosis, so the tumor keeps on growing and growing and growing. Next, a very important point to remember is that the cell surface membrane blebs in both necrosis and apoptosis. But in necrosis, the cell membrane ruptures, causing leakage of cell contents, whereas in apoptosis, the cell membrane remains intact. Instead, the apoptotic cell fragments into smaller apoptotic bodies. These apoptotic bodies are then phagocytosed or ingested and removed from the tissues. Finally, in both necrosis and apoptosis, the chromatin of the nucleus condenses irreversibly in what is known as pycnosis. Important to note, in necrosis, pycnosis is followed by karyorrhexis, in which the nucleus ruptures, and then karyolysis, in which the nuclear material dissolves and disappears. Equally important, karyorrhexis and karyolysis do not occur in apoptosis. Instead, the nucleus is phagocytosed inside an apoptotic body. Okay, so let's wrap up. Cells are injured by damaging stimuli, either reversibly or irreversibly. Reversibly damaged cells can be repaired and returned to homeostasis. Irreversibly damaged cells undergo either apoptosis or necrosis. Apoptotic cells shrink, fragment into apoptotic bodies, which are phagocytosed. Important to note is that apoptosis is not accompanied by inflammation and is mostly physiological, but can be pathological if the cell cycle is not controlled appropriately, as in cancer. Then, necrotic cells, on the other hand, swell and burst open, releasing their contents to the external environment. In addition, the nuclei become condensed, called pycnosis, the nuclei then fragment, called karyorrhexis, and finally the nuclear material dissolves, called karyolysis. Necrosis is always accompanied by inflammation and is always pathological, yielding quite a difficult clinical picture and calling for rapid intervention, often a life-saving procedure. Alright, that was it for now. If you found this video helpful, please support the channel by liking and subscribing and connect with us on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, all the very best.